You sit here, I'll take a few minutes.
Oh,
Yeah, it's so good to see you, man.
Hey, Rick, how are you?
Well, good afternoon and a warm welcome to all of you. I'm Ashley Tellis. I'm a senior fellow here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And on behalf of you and the endowment, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Arvind Panagariya to our building today. As you all know, Professor Panagariya is the chairman of India's 16th Finance Commission. For those of you who don't know what the Finance Commission is, I'll give you a 2-second introduction. It's a constitutionally mandated body and is a critical instrument for the success of fiscal federalism in India. The Commission recommends how the government's revenues at the center should be shared with the states. It designs solutions for fiscal management at both the union and the state levels. And it recommends improvements to the public finance system. So at this point, I suspect Professor Panagariya is a favorite personality in India's states because he holds the key to how much money will come from the central coffers to India's many states. I must say India is lucky to have Professor Panagariya in this role. Arvind was previously the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog, the Government of India's internal think tank, the successor to the old Planning Commission. But beyond his public service, I say India is lucky to have him because he is an internationally renowned economist. His permanent position is the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia. And he's also the director of the Deepak and Neera Raj Center on Indian Economic Policies at the School of International and Public Affairs, also at Columbia University. So we have a true blue blood academic who has made incredible contributions both to the discipline of economic science in addition to all the contributions he has made in public life. Being an academic, it'll come to you as no surprise that he's also the author of numerous books. But I want to call out 2 books particularly for special attention. India, the Emerging Giant, which was published by Oxford in 2008, is truly a monumental study of the evolution of the Indian economy over the last several decades. And it's truly a book that is brimming with insight and is actually also quite formidable because it's not always an easy read, but it is a profitable one all the same. And more recently, his most recent book is The Nehru Era, Economic History and Thought, and Their Lasting Impact on India to this day, also published by Oxford in 2024. I think that is the book that the finance minister brought with her and waved in Parliament, right? Okay.
Yes.
So without further ado, I'm going to yield the floor to Arvind, who is going to speak to us for about 30 minutes. And depending on what he says, we might have a conversation between ourselves, or we might open it straight away to the floor. We'll see how the spirit moves us at that point. But welcome, Arvind. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Of course.
So thanks very much, Ashley, for this wonderful introduction. One can be a hero in the States, and one can also turn to zero very quickly.
Unlikely to happen here.
At least in some of the states. So I don't know which way this is going to go once we do our report.
Sure.
But we'll do our best. Sure. All right, so today I'm really going to speak about the future of India more. I will draw a little bit on the past, including perhaps some of the things that are in this latest book, The Nehru Era Economic History and Its Lasting Impact, because that history has something to do with the future. So let me begin actually first with this little bit of history drawing on the book. that India became independent in 1947, and then starting really seriously from 1950 onward, it began to put its institutions in place. And the way I put it is that the then Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had two big projects. One was a political project, and the other was an economic project. The political project was about establishing India as a democracy. And the economic project was about combating India's poverty through industrialization and growth. His political project was an incredible success. In the early decades, there's a lot of skepticism that India would succeed as a democracy. There was a famous book called The Dangerous Decades, which by Selig Harrison, which predicted that soon India is going to disintegrate because of its differences and diversity based on language, caste, and so forth. And that either it'll disintegrate or it'll turn into some sort of military dictatorship. But none of that came to pass, and India really was very successful democracy, to the point that even when Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi, who became Prime Minister in 1966 after his death, when for a short period imposed emergency, she ultimately went back to her democratic roots. And all stories are that actually she was very torn by what she had actually, by the path that she had chosen, and that ultimately really led her to reverse her decision and call for the elections again. So in this sense, I think this political project of Pandit Nehru was an incredible success. And I, as a part of my current job, I go to every single state. And we visit for 2 to 3 days. And so we get to see each of these states very closely. And it is mind-boggling how diverse India is. When you live in one part of the country, or even if you travel, say, either North India or even South India, you just cannot get a full sense of it when that you get after going to every single state. And particularly often, those of us who live, in either North India or South India, neglect the Northeast. And if you go to Northeast, boy, you see the diversity. Even within a small state, there will be 15 different tribes living next to each other who speak completely different languages, and it's remarkable how they even communicate with each other. So I think this was a huge success in this sense, and really European diversity comes out to be really nothing compared to the diversity that India has, and India is actually a single country, unlike Europe. I mean, Europe is a continent. However, I think the story today is about the economic project of Jawaharlal Nehru, and this turned out to be a failure, despite the fact that the objectives of what he wanted to do were the right ones. He saw that eradication of poverty had to be priority number one. He also saw quite correctly that this could not be done without stimulating growth through industrialization. So the essential broad contours of what he thought he would do were quite right, but the model he chose ultimately turned out to be the wrong one. And he was, by this time, beginning in the late 1920s, he had begun to turn into a very radical socialist. And a lot of the Indian leadership, actually, including the elite in the bureaucracy, were educated in Britain in 1930s and 1940s, where socialism was a very popular creed among the elite. And that got very deeply imbibed in the early leadership. And as a result, the regime that Nehru put in place in India, the economic model that he put in India, had a very strong socialist imprint on it. And I'll briefly describe, and then I want to just jump to where we are today, and we are going to go in the next few years. Nehru, for reasons that I will not explain here, one sought self-sufficiency. So he did not want to engage in international trade, wanted India to be self-sufficient, though he was not protectionist in the traditional sense of the term. His self-sufficiency objective was to basically, over time, rejig India's production basket to what he thought would be the consumption basket. So that is the path he wanted to take, but as it turned out, because it was a fixed exchange rate system, because the inflation in India ran much faster than inflation in the rest of the world, which led to these exports, the overvaluation of the exchange rate, and therefore exports doing poorly, and so it really led to this balance of payments issues, and so import licensing became very stringent. And initially, the regime remained relatively liberal until 1957 because India had accumulated a lot of sterling balances during the Second World War. It was running balance of payment surpluses during Second World War, and it, as a result, had these sterling balances. So it could draw on those, keep the trade policy liberal till 1957. But by 1957, those balances ran out. There was no appetite to do devaluation at the time. And so it led to then tightening of the import controls. So that was one feature of Nehru's model that he pursued. Then the second very important feature was that he felt that, look, if we are going to be self-sufficient, how are we going to invest? Machines are required. You have to invest in the machines. And so we have to know how to make machines. And so the model that he chose was to go for heavy industry first. So steel, machinery, chemicals, fertilizer, etc. Very, very heavy duty industries, which really was very contrary to the comparative advantage of the country. It was a labor abundant country. Capital was extremely scarce. It's a very low GDP country. 7% was the savings rate, so you really didn't have much capital, but what you did was to put it all into these heavy capital-intensive industries. So you ended up with this kind of allocation of resources where all the capital sat in one place with very little labor. Then all the labor partly sat in agriculture and partly sat into this cottage and small-scale industry. And so that was labor sitting with hardly any capital. And ultimately the skill formation, etc., all happens when workers get to work with capital. And over time, as you become more capital abundant, you acquire more complex capital, more complex machinery, and you then learn more complex skills and so forth. So the skill formation also did not happen. The production methods remain very traditional ones. The shirts were being stitched pretty much the same way in the 1980s as they were being stitched in the 1950s. So that was the model. So ultimately, the impact was that labor productivity remained extremely low, and growth really, which is what Nehru had sought, did not happen. So you have this period of 1950 to 1990, almost 40 years. The average growth rate during this period is about 4.2%. 2.2% is the population growth rate. So you're getting a per capita income growth of just 2%. Not only that, actually, whatever growth was happening was largely concentrated in this very heavy industry sector where there were very few workers. So therefore, whatever little growth happened effectively bypassed the bulk of the population, which was either in agriculture or in these small-scale enterprises. And so poverty reduction really did not happen. If any poverty reduction happened, it was in the 1980s, and that's because agriculture, the Green Revolution had finally begun to pay off, and because many of the poor were in agriculture, they benefited a little bit, and so some reduction happened, but not something big deal. 91, as we all know, was the watershed year, and that's when the reforms happened, began to happen. Now here, one of the things that my book tries to bring out very strongly is that even though the market reforms began to happen starting 91, the process was extremely slow. This virus of socialism, so to say, that had been introduced actually into the psyche of almost everybody, whether it's political class, whether it's bureaucracy, whether it's intellectuals, including the economists, even businessmen. They really kind of internalize it, and through this bequest from one generation to the other. We don't realize it, but once you think about it, generally what happens is that this is a stock flow issue, that the existing politicians is the stock. New politicians each year that are coming in is the flow. When the flow comes in and meets the stock, it more or less adopts what the stock believes in. And this continued to happen with the bureaucracy as well. And with the intellectuals, including economists, of course, it happened because all the professors, all the teachers who were teaching economics in these colleges, universities, etc., were all socialists, and so that is what got imparted. And that still continues. In the book, I at one point asked the question, is there a single economist I can think of who is completely homegrown and actually is an unqualified kind of advocate of markets? And arguably, I name one person. This is Govind Rao, but I can hardly think of anybody. Any economist that actually contributed to mobilizing support for liberalization, whether from inside the government or from outside, were all economists who had actually been educated in the United States. I can't even say that they were educated abroad, because hardly any economists which were liberalizers had their education in England. I think these are largely all US educated. And that, I think, continued to impact the country. And this is here, democracy interacting with the economics. That the whole process there, because it requires consensus building, the whole process of liberalization in India was much slower than was the case in China, where once Deng Xiaoping makes a decision, he faces some internal opposition, but overall his task is a hell of a lot easier than of any prime minister in India who wants to undertake reforms, including today's Prime Minister Modi, who arguably is really one of the strongest leaders to come along in India. But even then, as we saw with the experience of the farm laws, ultimately had to be withdrawn. We can come to that a little later. So very quickly now, that is the background with which we are working. And of course, so you see that there's this pessimism, optimism continues in the Indian policy debates. And the moment there is a decline in the growth rate, the pessimism really generally takes over, that the India story is about to end. And today, as we stand, last 2 quarters actually growth rate have been tepid. The average of the last 2 quarters, of the last 2 quarters of growth rate, which are the first 2 quarters of the current fiscal year 24-25, is about 6.4%, 6.5%, and there is suddenly the pessimism that India growth story is not going to pan out. And when we start talking about this middle income traps and whatnot, and coincidentally, World Bank writes a World Development Report on that. It's very subject, becomes a very hot topic in India. So in any case, that's where you are. I've been an eternal optimist on India. Not, I would say, in the 80s, I was a bit pessimistic, and some pessimism continued in the 90s, but I think by early 2000s, I was an absolute optimist. And that is the view I want to put out first. And what I'm going to argue is that, look, in the next decade, India will be a $10 trillion economy. It will, within the next 3 to 4 years, it will also become the 3rd largest. And if we take a much longer view, we can also address the question of whether Prime Minister Modi's Viksit Bharat ambition will be realized by 2047 or not. I will argue that certainly India has a very plausible case for this to happen, for all of this to happen, 10 trillion in the next 10 years, and also the Viksit Bharat ambition to be realized by 2047, 48. Whether or not it will happen, we will come back to argue. But I want to first lay down that there is a credible path that actually exists which gets you there. Okay, so that I think is my job in the rest of whatever 10, 12 minutes that I'm going to take. And since I'm going to talk about within the global economy where India stands, the first set of slides you're seeing basically are showing you the US at the top, China next, then is Japan, but towards the end, Japan becomes the fourth, not the third. Germany is fourth, but towards the end, it becomes the third, and India is all the way down below.
Oh.
Now, yes.
Give us 1 second. I just want to.
There it is.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was wondering, why did we have this board here? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you all.
So you'll see that, but India actually has been growing steadily and faster than the other two, which are immediately above India, both Germany and Japan. And this is where the differences in the growth rates will quickly turn the rankings very soon. So here, I think this is my key table. And let me just spend 2 minutes to explain what I try to show in this table. So first column really focus on that. So India's rapid growth really begins in the year 2003. India's fiscal year is, runs from April 1 to March 31. So it's always 2003-4, which is the period starting from April 1, 2003 to March 31, 2004. So, but I'm just taking the short end, 2003-4 to 1920. That is just before COVID. In the last quarter of this 1920 year, COVID had already hit, and 1920 year also already shows a good bit of slowdown. But there you would see that China 14.6%. Now these are the growth rates in current dollars, and you will see in a minute, why I'm using current dollars. These are data you can download from the WDI, the World Development Indicators. So it's just coming from there, or you can take domestic GDP in domestic currency, use the exchange rate, and convert it. So it's either way you can get it. Germany 4.1, India 10.9%. Then you have Japan 1.5, United States 4.1, the world as a whole 5.7. Then at the bottom I give you the US GDP deflator. If you want to get to the GDP growth rate of each of these countries in real constant US dollars, then you use that GDP deflator at the bottom, subtract that out. So for India, for example, the real constant dollar GDP growth rate was 9% over this 17-year period. This is something people don't realize, actually, because we always report the growth rates in the domestic currency at constant domestic currency prices. And that growth rate for that period in India will be about 7% or 6.9%, something of that order, or maybe 7.1, but somewhere there. But you add there almost a couple of percentage points because rupee over this period appreciates in real terms against the dollar. And that adds another roughly 2 percentage points. Now, there is an impressive growth rate considering the fact that there were two major crises with which India was dealing. One everybody was dealing with, which was the global financial crisis in 2008. But then India also then had this, the present government inherited this major problem of non-performing assets in the banking sector, which then spilled over also in the non-banking finance companies sector. So there was a major internal financial crisis which had to be dealt with. In spite of all that, the real GDP growth rate over that 17-year period in real dollars is 9%, very impressive. There's something, it's what some of the other countries did, probably even better. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, China afterwards. But in the case of India, people don't realize that actually in real dollars when you come to it, it is actually quite impressive also, even if not, doesn't touch quite as highly as China's is. 15 to 23, I just wanted to put it out because just to show that China is not slowing down in 6.3, and probably it's not going to do something between 5 and 6% is what it will do in the coming years. And that's simply for two reasons. One is that any fast-growing economy grows actually at 8 to 10% kind of rates for not more than 3 decades. And China is no exception. It began to slow down once it had happened. It had completed its 3 decades. So mid-2010s decade, it slowed down. But also, I think policy-wise now, China has clearly begun to leave or substantially has left the model on which it was experiencing this high growth. The president Xi has really, taken a very different view of economic policies. So entrepreneurship has been greatly discouraged. So for both of those reasons, I think China's best growth years are now behind it. We can expect at the most 5 to 6% growth there. So that was the reason, the middle one. Now, even after you include the COVID years, India grows 10% in current dollars, and with the GDP deflated at 2.3, 7.7%. So I want to use these numbers to now project what it would look like 10 years from now. And the argument here is right now very simple one, that if India has done it for about 20 years, why can it not do in the next 10 or even longer? And I'll come to make my case why it can do it in a minute. But first, just a very quick look at the implications. So this is India and Germany. So India, so these numbers up to 2023 are actual numbers. After that, these are projected based on the growth rates that I have shown you here, which is 4% for Germany and 10% for India. These are all in current dollars. So in current dollar, by 2028, India crosses Germany, and actually does become $10 trillion by 2034. So it is very likely, I would argue, again, I'll make my arguments in a minute, but this is where I'm projecting that in 10 years' time, India can actually become a $10 trillion economy. Now that also has all sorts of geopolitical implications, because now it will not be just a $10 trillion economy, but it will also be significantly larger than the next best, the fourth one. Germany will be left behind by almost $3 trillion by India. So whatever goes with this large size will go with it in terms of the geopolitical implications as well. So we will see, we are already seeing this shift in power geopolitically happening towards India, but much more will happen, I think, in the next decade. This is now the top 4 I've drawn. You can see that US and China will still look much, will remain significantly larger players than India. In 10 years' time, United States looks like 45 trillion, China 33 trillion, India is still about 10 trillion. So it's a lower third, but nevertheless, it is going to be the large economy. What will be India's contribution to GDP growth? So this tries to take out, that on the margin, how much the GDP has grown, the world GDP has grown, and how much India has contributed to it. So this is the percentage contribution of India to the growth on the margin of the world economy. So you'll see if you go back all the way to 2003, India's contribution to the world GDP growth was 2.2%. And then the rest of the curve follows till 2023. Obviously, it fluctuates a lot because it all depends on how the world GDP grows and how the Indian GDP grows. Then it's linear only because I'm making an assumption that India will grow at this 10% and world economy will grow at 5.6%. So steadily, India's contribution to that grows, and by 2034, India begins to contribute about 9% of the world GDP. So it does emerge in 10 years' time as a major engine of growth of the world economic growth. Okay, so that's where we are. Now I take this whole scenario to the 2047, 48, and this is again for India, hot topic of debate, whether what the Prime Minister has said that Viksit Bharat ambition can be realized or not. And this tries to make the case that, yes, indeed, it is a feasible proposition in view of what has happened in the past. The numbers are that basically, the World Bank draws the threshold that it defines a country as a high-income country if it achieves a per capita income of $14,005 in 2023 dollars. Okay, in 2023 dollars. India's per capita income, this is the gross national income, GNI, which is not quite the GDP, but GNI. And I'm using the GNI figures, although it says GDP there, but one can do it on, this is on GDP, but GNI is only a little bit different, and I've done the numbers on GNI, very similar. So that's not an issue. So 2,557 was the GDP per capita in 2023-24. Now, in order to cross that threshold of 14,005, Indian per capita income in constant dollars will have to grow at 7.6%. That is what the last row tells you, that if per capita income were to grow in constant dollars at 7.6%, then it crosses 14,005. It reaches actually 14,835. How do we know that this is per capita, by the way? So if I look at the UN Population Division's growth projections, India is shown to grow about between 23-24 to about 2050 is shown to grow about at 0.6%, the population. I suspect it's going to be much lower than that because for a while India has been, the total fertility rate has actually dropped below 2.1. It's about 2 currently. And so it will perhaps not grow at 0.6% steadily. The population is going to probably be a lot lower in 2047 than what the UN Population Division predicts. But let's play with what, so I here say that, okay, let us assume nevertheless that the population will grow that much. And that would require, therefore, a GDP growth rate of 7.6 plus 0.6, that is 8.2%. Is it feasible? I'll argue it is, because in constant dollars, for the first 17 years I showed you, India actually grew at 9%. Including COVID years, it declines, but the 7.7. So you need to push maybe another 0.5% from 7.7, even if you take the lower of the two growth rates that I showed you in the earlier table. Now, this is where finally I come to making the case that indeed this is something feasible. Now, why is this feasible? First of all, India has internal political stability. We often neglect that condition, but there is a very, very important necessary condition. No country which is politically unstable has grown rapidly. So that condition is fulfilled, necessary but not sufficient. Then there was scope for catch-up. We saw that India's per capita income is actually only 2,558 or something, very low still, compared with China, Korea, United States. What that tells you is that at the existing technology, it is feasible for per capita income to be much higher. Even without any new innovation, nothing, you can do that. So this is what the economists call the catch-up. So there's a huge scope for catch-up for India from where it is today. So that again is a necessary but not sufficient condition, but it is there. Now what helps India also going forward is two features of India's population demography. One is that it's a very large population. Now large population has the advantage that when it comes to the provision of public goods, roads, railways, civil aviation, but also the digital infrastructure, your per capita cost is lower, simply because public good is something that is shared by the population, and adding a few more users to that public good doesn't add to your cost of production because it's already there. And so practically the marginal cost can be zero. So in this sense, when it comes, it's building roads, civil aviation, as well as railways, etc. The costs are going to be per capita quite low because of the large population. In addition, actually, when it comes to digital infrastructure, Not only that, on the production side, your cost is per capita cost continues to decline with the population size, but on the user side also, your benefits multiply because if you get to interact with a billion people as opposed to maybe only a million on the digital platform, your benefits are that much larger. So that's the size effect. Then the population is also young. Young population helps you in two ways. One is that it translates into a larger workforce per thousand population. With the larger workforce, more people working per thousand population, it also means larger per capita income given the labor productivity. In addition, the younger population also saves as opposed to older population which actually lives on the past savings. Whereas the older population is decumulating savings, the younger population is accumulating it, and so having a larger young population also gives you faster, therefore, growth in capital stock. So investment can rise faster, so that helps as well. Now, finally, rapid progress in building infrastructure that has been going on. If you go back, and again, as I said, as a part of my current job, I've been going to every single state, and it is quite remarkable the transformation that has happened in India of the roads, particularly, the accessibility used to be so poor, but today you can even go to Northeast, wherever. We went to Sikkim actually, and the BRO, the Border Road Organization, which builds these roads because of this, they do the roads on the border. We went some, on the mountains going towards China, almost up to 13,000 feet. We didn't go beyond that because of certain roadblock issues, but road was incredibly smooth. Absolutely, it just took us as little time as it should have taken for something like that. So that's just an example, but you can drive almost all through India today. The national highways have been built up enormously. Same with airports. Within the last 10 years, the number of airports has more than doubled. And air traffic, both cargo as well as passenger, has been growing very, very rapidly. So all this infrastructure buildup is happening, will continue to happen because finally this central government particularly has figured out how to invest in infrastructure effectively and how to build roads effectively, how to run airports effectively. So that part is going on. And there is some continued reform in spite of political challenges. This is where I sort of bring in that the socialism of the past is still kind of haunts the country. And some of the slowdown, for example, did happen in the second term of the Modi government after the farm laws had to be withdrawn. And that did kind of, that ultimately resulted also in the labor laws which had been enacted by the parliament not being implemented. So labor laws still remain to be implemented. So there is this issue, but what is good about the government is that where it cannot implement, it leaves that, but goes on to things that it can actually implement. And so, for example, in the current budget, the government decided to simplify the personal income taxation. There's something I'd been writing for some years now, that there was so much of this exemptions within the income tax system that it was greatly distorting the whole economic activity. Now it has been cleaned up completely, and the personal income taxation has been fully simplified. The government also announced in this budget to appoint two major committees to look at the entire regulatory regime, one in the financial sector and one in the non-financial sectors. And that again is something that is very important because as India replaced the planning system gradually by the market mechanism, it also started putting in place these regulatory agencies. And so regulatory agencies have multiplied, and usually regulatory agencies are run by the bureaucrats. And that does lead to, the bureaucratic instinct often is that I don't want anything bad to happen. So you are targeting the fellows who are going to misbehave the most rather than the vast majority which will not misbehave. So as a result, regulation has the tendency to become excessively tight. And so periodic reviews are very important. Both of these have been announced. The government has also taken a few other reforms, which I'll not talk about. But the point I want to make is that the government, in spite of all the roadblocks, where reforms are feasible, it moves into those territories. And that process is luckily continued. So last slide, what could go wrong? Obviously, and we can talk about it in the discussion, it is going to be a turbulent and increasingly protectionist global economy. We will talk about that in the discussion, so let me not say more about it. Technological advances pushing towards reshoring of economic activity. I argue against each of those, but these are issues of challenges to the country. The challenge of internal economic transformation, that I think is a serious one. That I think is where the real issue for India remains. And this is about the fact that India's development process, at the beginning said about heavy industry focus of Jawaharlal Nehru, that heavy industry focus remains till today. It's less so, but structure of the Indian economy is still highly capital intensive and skilled labor intensive. India's successful industries include, for example, you got machinery industry, you got petroleum refining industry, you got automobile industry, you got two-wheeler industry, you got pharmaceuticals, you got IT industry, you got financial markets. All of these are either capital intensive or skilled labor intensive. The result of that, of course, is that India's workers are sitting where? About 46% of India's workers are sitting in agriculture. Another 40% are sitting in very tiny enterprises which employ fewer than 10 workers each. So generally low productivity enterprises. The same small scale industries that I talked about, cottage home industry, not quite cottage industries anymore, but still very small with low labor productivity. And the corporate sector, which is the large one, employs only 7 or 8% of the workforce. So you still have that kind of transition still to happen. And that also means that urbanization in India is still a bit of a distant dream, because you still are, last census 2011, a bit old, had put the figure at 31%. Today it might be 36, 37%, which is still very low. All successful high-income countries are highly urbanized, whether you look at South Korea, you look at Singapore, you look at the United States, you look at there is no country which becomes high income without becoming very highly urbanized. You can become urbanized without becoming rich. Brazil is a country which is very urbanized, but it's still it's not a high income country. But there is no high income country which is not highly urbanized. So that remains a challenge. So that's where I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me take this. Just keep that here. Well, I wish I had you as my economics professor 20 years ago. That was wonderful, because I thought the way you laid out the argument had absolute clarity, even for folks who don't follow the Indian economy closely. But let me bug you about a couple of things, Arvind. The assumption that you make about a 10% trend growth rate for a substantial period of time obviously gets you the results that you put on the chart.
Correct.
But how does that trend growth rate hold up against what I see as an immediate demographic challenge, which is India's halfway through the demographic boom already. So the number of young people waiting to enter the economy are not as great as one would wish. Doesn't that mean that India will have to do much better in terms of productivity gains, given that it will face both a contracting population and an increasingly smaller cohort of the young population? How do you think about that?
Okay.
Because that's a dynamic problem,
Yes.
right? So how does one think about that?
So this, population issue, this demographic issue that all the richer countries are facing, India will probably start facing it at a lower per capita income than those other countries. right? China began to face it at a significantly higher per capita income than India probably will. But still, if you're looking at the next 15 years, 20 years, you still have got this young population, massive young population present. Uh, Again, as I've been going around India, you go to any crowded place today. I mean, you see the young and young faces only. I mean, you can look at some of the Kumbh pictures, even though there more older people come in proportionately, than represented in the population. But still, you will see it's a very young population. Now, TFR, the total fertility rate, has dropped below replacement level for sure. So the children entering at the birth level are now fewer, right? But still, you still have the ones, in the next 10 years, those who were born 10 years ago would still be there, right? And the base of young population is still quite large. Yes.
Yeah, so there's like a bow wave effect, right? These children are already born, they're there.
They're there.
But how do you...
And by the way, also the infant mortality rates, etc., are on the decline continuously. So more will survive also. So there is that too.
So how does one then profitably bring this young population into the market? So there's that whole question of the jobs issue, right? Which seems to be quite serious. It seems to be elusive in some sense because we can't quite find the solutions. What is your thinking on how you can do labor absorption while the going is good?
So this is where I think challenge is much bigger. In terms of labor, I don't see a huge challenge because there's another dimension which I should mention, which is the women participation in the labor force. In India, it has been so incredibly low. So finally, after last 6-7 years, it's rising and quite at a good pace. So more women coming so workforce will grow large. So you have no problem of the workforce getting larger and all. So I'm less concerned about that. But how do you employ them gainfully, right? So that I think is the bigger challenge. My view has been for many, many years now that ultimately, if you want a development process which is more inclusive, meaning, you can promote inclusion through redistribution, but that's not the best kind. You want inclusion such that workers, individuals themselves generate their own incomes, which are, good, healthy incomes. That requires creating industries or effectively putting in place policies that will lead to the growth of industries that use a lot more labor per unit of capital than is currently the case. Now, I talked about this socialist mindset that has really continued to impact India all around. So, in India, everybody is fascinated by building big things, aeroplanes, defense products, IT products, AI, startups, all this, very heavily capital intensive. It is fine, if you're competitive, you can do it, that's all fine. But that doesn't solve your employment problem. One example, auto industry, for instance, total labor costs in auto industry from the watchman all the way to the CEO are about 4% of their total costs. It's not, even though in absolute terms, a few, maybe 200,000-300,000 people, or maybe even 1 million people may be employed there. But it's still small, Likewise, IT industry, maybe 5-6 million people are employed there, but that's still small. So you got to go to labor-intensive industry, which is apparel, footwear, furniture industry, a lot of the kitchenware, all the light manufacturers. And that requires, that will require at some point, these labor laws to be implemented. Some of this can be done through the states. So I've been talking to some of the states. Some chief ministers are more kind of forward-looking and may go that way. So we've been talking to people like UP chief minister, Andhra Pradesh chief minister, etc. Hopefully, at some point, the government will. The central government itself will decide to implement these labor laws which have been passed, which the tough thing has been done, meaning getting these through the parliament has been done. So that will be required. The other area which is also very important, is the land. India will also need to solve the problem of urban land. In India, urban land is extremely expensive, and that's something that will need to be addressed. Now, different states are trying to address these things in their own different ways. A lot of awareness has come in. I think this jobs issue finally has also caught on. Everybody talks about it. So, some of the old issues where all this skepticism that why is growth important or inequality, those have now gone into the background largely. And so one can hope actually that some of these other reforms will happen.
Well, it was always refreshing to read your economic writing, because even when the tide was in favor of redistribution, you were always making the argument that if the pie is not growing, all you're redistributing is poverty, right? Yes. So you've been very consistent in making that point with Jagdish over the years. Let me come back to the employment question for just a moment. The Prime Minister is putting a lot of capital in the PLI-linked schemes that have come into vogue in the last few years. But it seems to me that most of them have been directed at industries that meet all these characteristics that are less than ideal, right? They're highly capital intensive. They always are at the cutting edge of the technology ladder. So how does that actually help him in terms of advancing the agenda of employment? Because at the end of the day, employment, as you point out, will be both an economic issue, but equally a political issue, right? Because these are all young voters. And if they are condemned to jobs that are essentially marginal, then the promise that you are describing in this process is not something they're going to enjoy.
So I think politics will have to change a little bit. This requires, so it'll take a little while more, because still the bulk of the voters, where are the voters sitting, by the way? One big block agriculture, 45%. Another big block micro and small enterprises. It's not micro, small, and medium. We say MSMEs. But the medium are not, it's micro and small, which is where the people are. So, the political rhetoric really focuses on those. Let's do things for farmers. Let's do things for the micro and small enterprises. And that is where, that's how you square the circle that address the issues. So you can also see now, and even in urban areas, by the way, there's a lot of poor people, right, living in tenements and whatnot. How do you get the votes? You can see the competition that has broken out now among especially in the state elections, that each party is announcing all sorts of giveaways. Somebody calling them freebies, somebody calling them bravery, somebody calling, by different names. But basically, these are a lot of giveaways. I personally don't think that actually these things win the elections, but there is a perception that they do.
And it breeds a competition that is vicious, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, ultimately, the Prime Minister is very measured in these matters, but his party had to also match, because if the other side is doing it, it's difficult for you not to. But we can argue, I can argue about the evidences. My own evidence is that, sometimes there is a spurious correlation in the victory of election and doing the giveaways. Parties that don't deliver really ultimately don't win. We saw in the latest election in Delhi. But before that, we saw in Andhra Pradesh, big giveaways had been done by the YSR government, and in the end, he also lost elections. Whereas those who have delivered even without any kind of giveaways have repeatedly come back. Naveen Patnaik, term after term, he kept winning the elections. At the central government, I don't think the Prime Minister has done any serious giveaways of the kind that are popular in the election space. He has come for a third time. So I think this will die its natural death in due course. But the way the political equilibrium will have to change is that a lot more urbanization has to happen before, because right now the vote bank, big vote bank is still remains in agriculture or rural areas.
I'm going to bring you folks into the conversation in a minute, but I have one last question, and that has to do with the area of your specialty. there has been no experience in the post-war period of an economy actually becoming successful if it is not integrated with the global trading system. And yet, as you point out, the headwinds for global integration today are stronger than ever. There is also still the remnant of the Nehruvian era ethos of being suspicious about trade, partly for political reasons and partly for protectionist reasons of vulnerable populations and so on and so forth. What is your judgment about India's trade story? We started out in 91 with some bold efforts, but it seems to me that that momentum has shifted in the other direction. And the United States, of course, has set bad examples for the rest of the world to follow, which everyone is following. And so the whole idea of now making at home, making for home, has suddenly become fashionable. How is India going to navigate these waters?
So now, India did open up quite a bit, and at least in terms of trade ratios, it doesn't look that bad. About exports to GDP ratio is about 20-21%. Imports to GDP ratio is about 25-26%. So overall, about 45, somewhere between 45 and 50% is the trade to GDP ratio. It's quite decent. I'm sure most of us would like it to be even higher, but so that's the first point. Second, now there was some reversal of the trade liberalization in India in the year 2017-18. See, this is where the whole, small events can lead to outcomes that last too long. And what had happened then was that India introduced the GST, the Goods and Services Tax, which led to, because it was in transition, and initially there was some hiccups, some teething pains, as a result of which this indirect tax revenue declined or did not rise as fast as it should have. So the revenue needs were there. So 17-18, so this was introduced in July, GST was introduced in July 17. And so in the year 17-18 then, with the budget announcement, the tariff rates went up a bit. So revenue was probably the reason, that's my gut feeling. And this was, Arun Jaitley was the finance minister at the time and all. And then of course, once you put tariffs in place, there are a lot of takers of those tariffs.
Constituencies that benefit from those.
Very quickly, they become, very resistant to reduction. But tide seems to be turning. Now, what is the reason and all, we can go into that, but certainly seems to be turning. The current budget does knock down several of the tariffs. So if you look back, at the end, there is an annex which lists a number of products where the tariffs have been actually reduced, which is a good news. And then let us see what happens as a part of the negotiation with the United States now. We heard yesterday about President Trump saying that I want reciprocal tariffs. Now reciprocal tariffs have two possibilities. One is that the US imposes tariffs and India also then says that, okay, I have been wronged by these high tariffs by the United States. I will do the same to the United States, which is the sort of thing that did happen actually with the steel tariffs. Although eventually both of them got rolled back and all. The other possibility is that India rolls back its tariffs, but also seeks from the United States some tariff concessions in certain products of interest to India, in particular, certainly in the textiles, clothing area, and US tariffs are a little bit higher, so there is scope there. In some of these products, the United States can also actually give India the concessions under GSP. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate, even WTO consistent. Now, in all this, how it's going to play out, I mean, I, as an optimist, think that Prime Minister Modi is a very smart Prime Minister. I think he will see, as long as, in the overall bargain that happens with the United States, he feels that it's a win-win bargain, that I have won also, while the United States wins. I think that's what he would do. And so I place as much probability on this kind of retaliatory or reciprocity of tariffs, leading to liberalization rather than protection, as I would put on protection, probably higher probability on the going liberal, but that remains to be seen. One point actually I should mention here, by the way, one very important point which escapes. Everyone says that there's a huge wave of protectionism, and we focus on the sanctions on Russia, the tariff war between the United States and China, and earlier steel tariffs, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at trade has been expanding as if none of this happened. Absolutely. Trade has a way of finding out. I mean, it always reminds me of one of the great trade economists, Robert Baldwin. Is the father of Richard Baldwin. Who, Robert Baldwin was a very wise man and a very strong advocate. Jagdish Bhagwati style kind of advocacy. So he always used to say that, look, the determined exporters find their way. The borders, even with tariffs, tend to be porous, and determined exporters find ways to send their goods out. Yeah. And that is what we have seen. That pre-COVID, the merchandise export peak was about $19 trillion, and services was $6 trillion. So total 25 trillion. Post-COVID, there was an immediate decline in this trade. But post-COVID peak now is 25 trillion of merchandise exports, 7 trillion of services exports, 32 trillion. So the marketplace from India's point of view is still incredibly large. India has only less than 2% share in merchandise exports, less than 4% share in services. Well, I think there's a huge scope for India to actually expand. So in this sense, I think there is no reason for India or any relatively small country to take a pessimistic view of the world markets. I think the policymakers, policy wonks, the intellectuals, they oversell this protection angle. I think those countries who actually want to are willing to get their own house in order, there's plenty of scope in the global marketplace for you to export.
Yeah, there's also an intellectual prejudice which privileges state action and presumes that state action is all determining, right? But your state action is constrained by the actions of the market and the incentives of the market. Absolutely. And you see that most clearly in the case of China, which has round-tripped exports to the United States via third countries. Right. And so that should be a...
Right. I mean, even the direct exports from China to India have not declined. Of course. Even they have continued to rise.
Of course. Well, I'm going to open the floor, so just raise your hand and identify yourself and keep your questions sort of as pointed as possible. Yes, sir.
Chris McRae, Norman McRae Foundation. I'm optimistic about India, but I would like to ask whether your whole framework might go wrong, because your first slide looked at a lot of nations, and so it looked as if you were assuming some kind of continuity. My father's work at The Economist was based very largely on being connected with von Neumann's hypothesis, which assumed that at some stage post-industrial would have to go above zero-sum thinking. And I don't see any of that in the way the models are currently working. So I still wonder if it's possible that the disruption we're going to come up to in the next decade is more than or different than we're looking at.
So yeah, that we have to wait and see. So this is about disruption, which could be much bigger in the years to come. And that's certainly possible. So I'm certainly assuming, that the disruptions will not be worse than what India experienced in the past 20 years, which is the global financial crisis, COVID. At least those two were very big disruptions, including also the third one, which is specific to India, which is the internal financial markets disruption. So at least, these are fairly significant disruptions during which this kind of growth has happened. Now, if the disruptions are massive. I mean, so I don't know what form they are going to take now,
Well, Earth collapsing.
Yeah, but then, all bets are off. I mean, then there is nothing, then the economics basically has nothing to say. I mean, if it's a Second World War kind of scenario one has in mind, or some sort of that magnitude of disruption, then of course, then it's all a different ballgame.
Do you think we could be, just to put a finer point on this, do you think we could be on the cusp of a real crisis in the global trading order? Or are the kind of perturbations that appear to be underway things that the system will somehow absorb and adjust to? What does your own gut tell you about this?
So, well, I mean, look, as far as the global global trading system is concerned, that disruption has happened. The most favored nation principle, which was the cornerstone of the entire system, really has gone out the window. To the point that now one can ask the question that when this negotiation, let's say even between India and the United States happens on reciprocity, whether it is liberalizing or it is protectionist, either way, is it going to follow MFN or not? And it is very likely that it will not. Because the United States is in no mood to actually do this on an MFN basis. Now, if the US doesn't do it on an MFN basis, India will
Sure.
follow
Because
suit.
you're creating incentives for others to do the same.
India will follow suit because then why open the market more than you have to?
Yeah.
So
In some sense, India is small potatoes on this because it's the bigger trading partners of the United States. And
I
they
mean,
follow.
at the same time though, India may have a little more to worry that maybe they are more vulnerable to challenges in the WTO. The United States is too big a player to be vulnerable there. But still, I think when it comes down to it, India will also say that, well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. Right now, let's go the discriminatory way, because the fact is that whether small or large, influential or not, today there is no dispute settlement body that is functioning. And therefore, if you violate, worst that can happen to you is that a panel is established against you, which rules against you. Fine, but I have my right to appeal to the appellate body, bring me the appellate body, then we'll talk. So I think.
Yes, ma'am. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. I am Bhavna. I work with Center for Strategic and International Studies. My question is what you mentioned about market-making process, wherein private funding could be unlocked, specifically when we look at from an urbanization agenda, and India is going to be urbanized in the next 20 years, or given that 2047 is the goal. How do you think
Organizing?
urbanization?
Urbanization, yeah.
So what do you think are the biggest challenge in unlocking private capital? What would it take? Because urbanization is largely funded from public funds currently. What would it take for private sector to come into the urbanization as India moves in that direction?
See, on this, I think at least initial facilitating role has to be played by the government. Then the private capital will get unlocked. I'll tell you in what way. First of all, even though urbanization in India today, we say 31% according to census 2011, last census. Actually, that is counting many of what we call the census towns. And these census towns have certain characteristics which they satisfy, like certain density of population, a male population which is non-agricultural, and another characteristic. That's what defines a census town. But these census towns actually are not statutorily, administratively, they are not urban. The administration is still rural. These are panchayats. And you need to convert those panchayats into municipalities, because no industry is going to locate itself in what is a rural jurisdiction. So in this sense, I think that's one sense in which the government has to begin to convert areas that, particularly areas that are peri-urban and on the periphery of many of these larger towns, convert them, absorb them into the municipal systems. That's one thing. But there is an overall issue of urban land, which is incredibly expensive in India. And there are many things that the government can do. First and foremost, in India, you go to any town, central business district, very low buildings you will see. There are no tall buildings. If tall buildings appear, they usually go and appear in the periphery. Completely reverse of what you see in any major city, whether you look at New York City, even Washington DC, you see that it's a central business district where the taller buildings exist, and then you go to the suburbs where you got these, single family homes. And that of course makes the land again very expensive because available workable land is very little. Then there is a whole issue of conversion of land from agricultural use to industrial use on the periphery of the towns. That again states tend not to do. Within the city also, conversion from one use to another. If it is for manufacturing, you can't then convert it for services. So, in industries, of course, the come and go, meaning that, some declining industries, some rising industries. So you have to be able to convert. But those conversion laws are also very difficult. So a lot of things that actually the governments need to do. Now here, it is the state governments actually which have to do mostly. It's central government doesn't, land largely in India, except for land acquisition, is a state issue. So states have to really start. Now some states are doing well. Tamil Nadu, for example, is doing some good stuff. Telangana, doing some good stuff there. So there are some states are doing. Gujarat has a good policy actually for urbanization, and you can see their urbanization is very orderly. So that, in a way, in the years to come, each state will have to actually work out a strategy that, look, how are we going to handle urbanization? What is the right model? And there are some successful models, such as the one that Gujarat has successfully implemented. So,
yes, ma'am. It's coming.
Hi, I'm Patrice Robitaille. I'm from the Federal Reserve Board. And I guess one comment on the first set of slides. I wouldn't use nominal GDP in dollars. I'd go back to the real GDP growth. But I could explain later. But it presumes that you've got pretty fast productivity growth that's embedded in that. It's increasing the real exchange rate. But the other questions I had were, like, I'm pretty ignorant about the disparities, the huge disparities among states. And I guess what I would expect is there'd be a bit more migration, interstate migration, than there appears to be now, or it has been. So is it the case now, like with increased digitization, the money is following the person rather than keeping that person tied to where that person came from? Or, I mean, do you expect more interstate labor mobility to help at least promote greater interstate convergence? And or if you talk a lot to these state governments, and do they see like the success? I don't know if you call them relative success states, but are they like the ones in the South that are more vibrant, that have a relatively unfettered service sector that doesn't have all these restrictions that kind of cobble the industry? Are they seeing that and thinking about, well, what they should do? Or so I guess I just was wondering if you had insights into like the political economy of labor reform at the state level and migration.
So very good question. Yes, so the interstate disparities are large, and actually they have grown in the past several years. Whenever an economy grows fast, these disparities, generally the regional disparities, rise. As far as social indicators are concerned, they converge. But the economic indicators, mainly the per capita income, has a tendency to diverge. That's one fact. Second is that you would see that as most of these very highly successful countries, you would see that population tends to concentrate along the coast. You can look at China, you can look at the United States, you can look at Singapore, you can look at South Korea uniformly. Now, one very interesting phenomenon that is happening in India also is that the most successful states in India, I would say, so these are the states whose per capita income are in the top 20% of the Indian distribution, right? So anybody whose per capita income is 80% of the richest, which is Telangana, or more. There are 7 such states. So you can have Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Kerala, Karnataka, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Haryana. 5 of these are on the coast. Remaining 2 are globally linked into the global market through IT. So Telangana is not a coastal state, but its major kind of economic activity is the IT. So that's globally linked. Haryana is also very large part in Gurugram is IT dominated, which is also globally linked. There is also a lot of migration from the other parts of the country into these states. Actually, there's a lot of migration also in Punjab. Actually, a lot of the local Punjabis hardly do any farming these days. These are workers from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh who are coming in and doing most of the farming in Punjab. So there is a lot of migration happening, but a lot more could happen if the cities were a bit more hospitable to the migrant workers, by which I mean at least good provision of dormitory housing where they could come in, stay, and work. Because the way the migration happens, you come, you never leave your home cold turkey. I mean, most of the time you come in, work for 4 or 5 months, go back, come work for 6 months, go back, and then gradually you begin to grow roots in the urban areas and become a permanent migrant ultimately. But so initial years you need this kind of low cost dormitory housing. In India, this tradition has not been there. Now, some of the states, Tamil Nadu is beginning to build that. Hopefully, others will do that as well. But so to unlock the industrial capital, you need these basic amenities to be provided by the state, by the governments. And that process, I think, still. There's one last point to make, which is that, in a paradoxical sort of way, some of the some of the redistribution, some of the anti-poverty programs that India has carried out to generate development in the rural areas has also had the impact of people then being less incentivized to migrate to the urban areas. Now, if you think of, for example, many of these local administrations, rural local administrations, these are called panchayats in India. This is the 3rd tier. So you got first tier is the central government, union government. Second tier of administration is the state government. And then the 3rd tier, which is local, municipalities in the cities and panchayats in the rural areas. Now, a lot of money goes from the central government in the form of grants, also from state governments in the form of grants to these local bodies, local rural administrative bodies. So they have an inherent now incentive not to convert into urban bodies. So there is that challenge as well. So as you can expect, as it has been the case, things will move a bit slower in India than in the other countries. But at the same time, there is momentum. So and the governments also do see. And one great thing about a large country like India is that there are always some states which see things the right way. Gujarat clearly, does that. Tamil Nadu nowadays, very much so. current administration in Andhra Pradesh, very forward-looking. So there are a number of these states. You also have the laggards like West Bengal, Punjab, where things are not moving or are going in the wrong direction. But you have it all.
We'll take the last question to you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Dr. Panagariya. My name is Shashwat. I work at Center for Strategic and International Studies. And I would also build up on the questions around the states because, as you rightly mentioned, it's the internal economic transformation of India, which is a bigger challenge. So as a head of 16th Finance Commission, you have a very important task of incentivizing states to move in the right direction, especially the laggards one, the eastern and the northeastern one. So what steps are you planning to take to incentivize them? And second, on the cities, you mentioned the states like Gujarat, Andhra, Telangana doing well, but they have been doing well for past 20 years. Hyderabad came 20 years ago. Gujarat picked up in last 15, 20 years. But none of the new cities have come up. Gurgaon also came 20 years ago. But there is no new city which has come up which will drive the economic transformation of that state or the country. So how will you incentivize states, especially the eastern, northeastern, and cities?
Yeah, so I'll pass on your first question, which I can't answer.
He still works for the government of India. That's right.
But on the cities, I mean, in India, building new cities is very challenging. And some new cities have been tried, but not very successful. We have this Naya in Chhattisgarh, Naya Raipur, which is now doing better. I mean, I'd visited in, I think, 2017, and I visited again. So now, between 17 and now, big change. And of course, it came from the fact that the state government moved to Naya Raipur, and that made a big difference. But otherwise, in general, Chandrababu Naidu in Andhra had tried to build the Amravati, and so he's going to start doing it. I mean, he has started doing it, picked up the project again, and he'll do it. I have no doubt he will successfully do it. But this has been challenged. But urbanization, to me, seems that therefore will need to focus more on making the existing cities more hospitable. Also, I think there needs to be some recognition that second tier and third tier cities could potentially be better kind of destinations for migration, because the large metros are a challenge. They also have more opportunities, which is why more and more people come there. But I think with some policy, if the policy incentivizes a bit migration to second tier and third tier cities, that is, I think, a better deal, because there the labor-intensive industry can also come. The labor-intensive industry can't be in these large industries, large cities, because the cost of living is incredibly high. So I've spoken to people who do apparel, for example. They all say that we have to go to a second tier or third tier city because cost of living has to be low, so that they don't have to pay such a high wage. And I suspect that that's a model which has a bit of a better chance of succeeding in facilitating the migration of population from rural to urban areas.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, Arvind, for coming here. And you're always welcome to come back. It would be a delight to have you. On behalf of all of you, I want to thank you. Thank Arvind for being with us. Come back to the Carnegie Endowment when we have the next round, whenever. We do these things sometimes virtually, increasingly in person. So you're welcome to come in whatever format you want to be part of us. Thank you very much for coming today. And enjoy Valentine's Day. All right? Valentine's Day? Yeah, all right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. You were great.